April 25, 1945. The air over central Germany smells like wet earth, burned fuel, and cordite. American soldiers stand on the banks of the Elbe River, staring east into a gray horizon where the war is still raging. Behind them, the roads are crowded with wrecked German columns, abandoned guns, shattered trucks, exhausted prisoners. Ahead, beyond the water and the smoke, Berlin is already trembling under the weight of Soviet artillery. By the end of 1944, the Third Reich is no longer expanding. It is bleeding out slowly, violently, and in every direction at once. In the West, Allied armies push through France and Belgium after the Normandy landings, tightening pressure on Germany's borders. In the East, Soviet forces surge forward with a scale and brutality unmatched on the European continent, crushing entire German army groups and swallowing territory at a terrifying speed. But Germany is still dangerous. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble in December 1944, proves that a cornered enemy can still kill in staggering numbers. Snow falls thick over the forests as American units dig in against armored spearheads. The fighting is close, desperate, and costly. And even when the German attack collapses, the lesson remains: victory will not come without more blood. By early 1945, the strategic map looks like a tightening noose. From the west, the Americans, British, and Canadians prepare to cross the Rhine. From the east, the Soviets mass on the Vistula and the Oder, building an avalanche of men, guns, and tanks. Berlin is more than a capital. It is the nerve center of the regime that dragged Europe into fire, home to Hitler's bunkers, the ministries of terror, and the machinery of war. But by 1945, it is also something else, a future bargaining chip. A city that will decide not only how the war ends, but what the peace will look like. The Western Allies do not approach Germany as a single, unified fist. Under Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American-led coalition is built on coordination, balancing British ambitions, American manpower, and a logistical system stretched across an ocean. Fuel, ammunition, bridges, hospitals, replacement troops, everything must move forward on wheels and rail lines that are constantly breaking under the strain. At the same time, the Soviet Union is advancing with overwhelming weight. Their armies are already positioned on the direct road to Berlin, closer than any Western force can realistically match. The Red Army has endured unimaginable losses since 1941, and now it believes deeply, violently, that it has earned the right to take the Reich's heart with its own hands, and hanging over everything is diplomacy. At Yalta in February 1945, the Allies have already discussed occupation zones and post-war control. Berlin lies deep inside territory, agreed to fall within the Soviet sector, an invisible border drawn on maps long before the city's ruins are reached. Churchill sees the end of the war like a storm cloud that doesn't vanish when the fighting stops. For him, Germany's defeat is only half the story. The other half is what rises afterward. And by 1945, he is increasingly convinced the Soviet Union will not simply liberate Eastern Europe, it will hold it. To Churchill, Berlin is not just a city, it is leverage. A future negotiating weapon that could decide the fate of Poland, the Balkans, and the very balance of Europe. He watches Soviet forces driving west like a tide, and he imagines a continent split in two, one side free, the other sealed behind barbed wire and fear. His warnings grow sharper, his messages to Allied commanders carry urgency, even impatience. If the West reaches Berlin first, Churchill believes it might slow Stalin's grip, or at least force a different settlement at the table. But Churchill is not commanding the armies, he is advising them. On the ground, Eisenhower is staring at a map that bleeds with hard numbers: casualty reports, fuel consumption rates, bridge capacities, ammunition stockpiles. Berlin is a powerful symbol, but symbols do not refill tank battalions or replace shattered infantry companies. By early 1945, the Allied advance has already consumed enormous resources fighting through France, the Siegfried Line, and the brutal urban battles for cities along the Rhine. Eisenhower's view is rooted in a simpler question: what ends the war fastest? Germany's armed forces, though collapsing, still exist in large formations. Millions of soldiers remain in the field. Entire units are retreating into Central Europe, hoping to surrender to the Americans and British instead of the Soviets. Eisenhower wants to crush those formations, prevent a last-ditch national redoubt in the Alps, and split Germany apart so it cannot regroup. Berlin, from his perspective, is a trap, an urban fortress where troops could be chewed apart street by street, building by building, against defenders who know there is nowhere left to retreat. And there is another reality: the Soviets are already closer. Their armies are positioned on the Oder River, within striking distance. Even if the West lunges for Berlin, it risks colliding with Soviet forces in the chaos of the final weeks. In that narrow space between Churchill's political instinct and Eisenhower's military discipline, the decision begins to form not as surrender, not as weakness, but as calculation. And as April approaches, the pressure shifts from theory to the sound of artillery on the horizon. The geography alone tilts the race. The Red Army is already poised on the Oder, only a short drive from Berlin's outer defenses. Their supply lines run across land they've fought through for years, backed by massive stockpiles of guns and rockets. Soviet commanders can concentrate force with brutal speed, entire armies fed into a single breakthrough like a hammer descending again and again. The Western Allies, despite their momentum, are operating at the far edge of a supply system that stretches back to the ports of France. Every mile forward costs fuel, tires, spare parts, bridging equipment, and time. By early spring 1945, that logistical strain is not theory, it is the boundary of what the armies can physically sustain. Then comes the casualty math, cold and unforgiving. To seize Berlin, an attacker would have to smash through Germany's remaining defensive belts, cross rivers, fight through suburbs filled with barricades, and then enter a city already prepared for a last stand. The German military still has pockets of veteran units, Hitler Youth formations hardened by fanaticism, and SS elements that see surrender as betrayal. Urban combat turns tanks into targets, streets into kill zones, and basements into strongholds. Every building becomes a bunker. Every intersection becomes a battlefield. Eisenhower weighs this against what Berlin is worth, especially when Soviet forces are already committed to taking it. In practice, the Western Allies would be spending thousands of lives to capture a city they might not even be allowed to hold long-term, because occupation zones have already been discussed at the highest levels. And beneath all of it lies a fragile alliance. America and Britain still need the Soviet Union to finish the war cleanly and prevent chaos across the continent. Soviet armies are tying down huge German formations in the east. Their pressure accelerates the collapse. If the West suddenly changes strategy to chase Berlin as a political trophy, it risks shattering trust at the exact moment unity is still required. Churchill senses the danger before it becomes visible in maps and speeches. He does not trust Stalin's long-term intentions, and he believes the future is being shaped in these final weeks quietly, decisively, behind the thunder of advancing armies. Berlin is becoming more than a target. It is becoming a dividing line between two worlds that haven't even officially formed yet. March turns into April, and Germany breaks apart in real time. In the West, American forces cross the Rhine in force, an event Hitler once believed impossible. Bridges that should have been blown remain standing just long enough. Engineers throw pontoons across dark water under fire. Armor rolls forward, loud and unstoppable, cutting through towns where white flags begin to appear in windows. Behind the Allied spearheads, columns of prisoners stretch down the roads, men in worn field gray, exhausted, hungry, relieved to be alive. Ahead, resistance still hardens in bursts. A village fights, a crossroads burns. A Panzerfaust flashes from an alleyway, and a tank erupts, turning steel into fire and screaming. On April 12th, Franklin D. Roosevelt dies. In Washington, Harry Truman inherits a war that is almost finished but not yet decided. The alliance continues moving forward, but the center of gravity is shifting. The question is no longer whether Germany will fall. It is who will stand on the ruins when it does. By mid-April, American units are deep inside Germany. Patton's Third Army is tearing through central regions. Simpson's Ninth Army advances in the north. Bradley's 12th Army Group holds the weight of the push. To the northeast, Montgomery's forces press toward the final objectives assigned to them. The road to Berlin exists on Allied maps like a straight line through history, but the war is not a straight line. It is traffic jams of vehicles, broken bridges, mines, artillery delays, and the constant need to secure flanks against units that refuse to die quietly. Then the order becomes clear. Eisenhower decides Berlin will not be the Western target. The main priority shifts to destroying German forces, preventing a southern retreat, and linking up with the Soviets along a controlled line. The Elbe River becomes the meeting point, the boundary where Western advance will halt and Soviet advance will finish the kill. This is not announced with drama. It is delivered the way all fateful military choices are delivered, through staff orders, operational directives, and quiet confirmations in headquarters tents. And while the Western Allies tighten their lines, the Soviets unleash theirs. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army begins the assault on Berlin with a force that shakes the earth itself. The Soviet attack opens in darkness, then explodes into light. Thousands of guns fire at once, turning the horizon into a continuous flash. The Seelow Heights, Berlin's eastern shield, become a slaughterhouse of mud, craters, and broken steel. German defenders are dug into elevated ground, and every meter forward costs bodies. Soviet infantry advances through smoke and waterlogged fields. Tanks churn in deep ruts, hit by mines, struck by anti-tank fire, burning where they stall. But the pressure never stops. Soviet commanders feed more units forward. Rockets howl overhead, artillery crawls closer. The defensive line bends, then begins to snap. Inside Berlin, the city becomes a fortress built from ruins. Civilians shelter in basements while the streets fill with shattered masonry. Smoke stains the sky. German units, regular soldiers, SS remnants, Volkssturm militia, and teenagers in uniform form desperate pockets of resistance. They fight in stairwells and subway tunnels, firing from windows, retreating through holes smashed between walls. By April 25th, Soviet forces encircle Berlin completely. The same day, American and Soviet troops meet at the Elbe, a handshake that is photographed as unity but carries a quiet undertone of finality. Two armies, two worlds, standing face to face while Germany collapses between them. In the West, generals receive the news and watch it settle into the record. Their forces are strong, their momentum is intact. But the mission has changed. Berlin is no longer their battlefield. Churchill's frustration hardens into dread. He understands what this means not just for Germany, but for the entire post-war map. The city that will symbolize victory will also shape influence. And influence, once established by soldiers on the ground, rarely retreats willingly. On April 30th, Hitler kills himself in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Above him, Berlin burns and breaks. The German command structure disintegrates. Orders become scraps of paper. Radio messages become desperate fragments. By May 2nd, the fighting in Berlin ends. The Soviet flag rises over the Reichstag, and the Red Army claims the final, brutal trophy of the European war. In the West, Allied soldiers continue clearing pockets of resistance and accepting surrender after surrender. The war is ending everywhere at once, but the ending looks different depending on where you stand. Because Berlin has fallen not only to an army, but into a future that cannot be negotiated back. When Berlin collapses, it does not feel like a clean victory. It feels like wreckage. Entire districts are flattened into gray dust. The smell of fire lingers in the streets, water pipes are broken, power is gone, and the city's remaining civilians move through ruins with hollow faces caught between relief and terror, unsure which army will decide their fate next. For the Soviet Union, Berlin is the final proof of endurance. Since 1941, it has absorbed destruction on a scale almost impossible to measure. Cities erased, millions dead, entire generations carved away by war. Now the Red Army stands in Hitler's capital and declares the cost justified by the result. Their victory is not symbolic to them. It is earned, paid for in blood, but the price is enormous. Soviet casualties in the Battle of Berlin are staggering. German losses are devastating to soldiers killed or captured, a regime collapsing into surrender, and civilians trapped inside the blast zone of history. In the West, the reaction is complicated. There is satisfaction that the war is nearly finished, and relief that Allied soldiers did not have to die in Berlin's final street battles. But there is also the sharp awareness that a line has been drawn across Europe, and it is being drawn by whoever occupies the ground. When the shooting ends, Berlin's fall does not just close a chapter, it opens a new era with the same cold logic as war. Soviet control of the city strengthens their position across Eastern Europe, where communist-backed governments will soon rise under Moscow's shadow. The Western Allies, despite winning the war, begin to realize that victory does not automatically translate into influence everywhere the Nazis are defeated. The agreements made during wartime now harden into reality. Germany is divided into occupation zones. Berlin, sitting deep in the Soviet zone, is also divided, an unnatural political fracture cutting through neighborhoods, roads, and lives. What looks like an administrative solution becomes a permanent symbol of separation. Churchill's fear becomes more than instinct, it becomes policy. Within a short time, the partnership between the West and the Soviet Union begins to freeze. Mistrust spreads through intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, and speeches. The enemy of yesterday is gone, but the suspicion of tomorrow is already moving into place. For Eisenhower and the American command, the decision not to seize Berlin remains rooted in military logic, reducing casualties, ending the war efficiently, and preventing German forces from reorganizing. It is a choice shaped by maps and manpower, not emotion. But history measures consequences, not intentions. Berlin becomes the city where the Second World War ends and the Cold War quietly begins, its streets no longer filled with gunfire, but with invisible pressure, ideology, and the presence of armies that do not plan to leave easily. War is never only about battles, it is about decisions, timing, and the limits of human endurance. Churchill understood the stakes of politics, Eisenhower understood the costs of combat. Both shaped the outcome, not through heroics in Berlin's streets, but through strategy, judgment, and restraint. Berlin, reduced to rubble, becomes more than a city, it becomes a symbol of calculated choices, the collision of human ambition and brutal reality. The West chose caution, the East chose momentum, and the consequences reverberated for decades. In the end, history is often decided not by who strikes first, but by who is willing to pay the price and who is already in position when the moment arrives. Berlin reminds us that war is not only fought with guns, but with foresight, patience, and the uneasy weight of what comes after victory.